Was Yu-Gi-Oh's biggest Tier 0 deck more dominant than Hearthstone's strongest meta tyrant? Was Magic's most powerful a bigger menace than Pokemon's? I'm Simon from Games Deconstructed, and in this video I'm hoping to answer the question of which card game had the most dominant deck of all time. There will be a couple caveats here on which decks are eligible to be included, but I don't want to front-load all that info onto you, so here's just the first one. This will be a comparison of dominance, how strong the deck was in its prime against other decks of its time. This may be indicative of how strong it would have been now, but a deck that was fearsome in 2011 might have been power-crept to hell and back since. This is not to show which deck would win today, besides that comparison would be a bit hard to do across card games. So we're gonna be starting with Magic the Gathering, and my first deck choice here is also going to be a showcase of some of the methods that we'll use throughout, so even if you want to skip ahead to some of the other ones, I'd at least watch the first one. The year is 2016, February. The format, Modern. The tournament, Pro Tour Oath of the Gatewatch, one of the biggest tournaments of the year. And to most players' surprise, there is a new deck in attendance. Now, Modern at the time is already a high-power format with a wide card pool, so completely rogue decks are somewhat out of the ordinary. Especially ones that look like a pile of draft chaff. But using the acceleration pieces in Eldrazi Temple and Eye of Ugin to pump out the newly printed, reasonably costed Eldrazi creatures like Thought-Knot Seer, Reality Smasher or Eldrazi Mimic, the deck is able to play both disruptively and efficiently, and most importantly ahead of the curve. Turns out, few decks in the meta were prepared for that, and after its strong showing in that initial tournament, how exactly did the deck fare in other events? Now, thanks to the good people of MTG Top 8, we are able to get the deck lists from tournaments played in that period. 185 of them to be exact. Tournaments, not deck lists. There are more deck lists. Ranging from small 12-person meetups to massive 2,000 plus player MTG extravaganzas. And analyzing the tournaments for which we have deck lists available, we are looking for how many of these decks were classified as Eldrazi aggro. Wherever possible, I'm gonna rely on existing deck classification to judge whether a given deck is the one that we're looking for, because I firmly believe that experts at the time were better able to classify whether a deck was Eldrazi aggro or Eldrazi control than, myself, who hadn't played Modern at the time and after 8 years have passed. Eldrazi shows up as 25.08% of the top 4 decks that we know about, with a very similar top 8 and top 16 rate. And though total tournament win rate isn't my favorite metric, as there's a lot of confounding variables other than deck choice that decide between a player coming in first and, say, fourth, Eldrazi aggro won a whopping 29% of the tournaments in this period. That's 54 out of 185 tournaments. And these metrics that we use here, top 8, top 16, top 32 representation and half-heartedly win rate, are going to be the main feelers for deck strength. Decks that are strong become more popular in tournament play, generally. There might be outliers to this, of course. Decks that are prohibitively expensive, rely on limited availability cards, or decks that are extremely hard to pilot or simply unfun, but strong decks tend to be played more and climb higher in the leaderboards than weak decks. Now, this deck retains its high presence from top 16 all the way to tournament wins, which is proof enough for me that its power not only caused its popularity to skyrocket, but that it could convert that popularity into actually winning those tournaments. Since we don't have the full deck lists for players outside of these top cuts, we don't know the exact proportions of the deck being busted and the deck being popular, impacting its high win rates and its high placements, and both of these would pull in the same direction. But since both are indicators of the deck's dominance, I'm happy to confirm the hypothesis that Eldrazi aggro was strong enough that in the hands of a skilled pilot, it took over a fourth of all top 4s during its reign, and won nearly 30% of tournaments played at the time. Its reign finally came to a close with Eye of Ugin, banned on April 4th, 2016, with the deck requiring either it or Eldrazi Temple for some of its more explosive starts. Losing half of them killed the deck. Some Eldrazi from these sets found home in other modern decks over the years, but the singular deck we're talking about ended, alongside its namesake, Eldrazi Winter. Now, this being the first deck we discuss, it naturally has to go to the top of my unofficial power ranking here. We will of course move it up and down as more decks get added. For our second MTG deck, we have to go back even further, to 2011. Caw-Blade, the deck we will be talking about, built upon an already proven concept called Caw-Go.
This is my favorite deck name of all time, actually. It is Caw-Go.
Which is of course the poison-type gym leader from the original Pokemon. Let's try that again, which of course is a play on words referring to it being a Draw-Go deck, which is of course Daenerys' husband. Let's try that again, which is of course a deck that doesn't do anything on their own turn but hold up interaction for the opponent's turn. It draws for the turn and then says your go to the opponent. The other part of the name is a reference to it playing Squadron Hawk, which allegedly goes Caw. Caw-Go was a disruptive control deck with the option of ending the game in a sort of death of 1,000 cuts using evasive creatures, like the aforementioned Squadron Hawks. The Blade part of the name, that elevated the deck to Meta Tyrant status, is a later inclusion, adding Stoneforge Mystic and a number of powerful artifacts it could tutor and cheat out, including the eponymous blades, Sword of Feast and Famine, and occasionally others like Sword of Body and Mind, allowed the evasive 1/1s to bring on devastating effects with their attacks, while the Caw-Blade player prevented the opponent from ever counterattacking using a mix of counterspells and removal. The deck also played Jace the Mind Sculptor, which was so busted it was an alternative game plan of its own. Seriously, this was like 3 decks in a trench coat, 1 tempo, 1 control and 1 a secret third thing, but somehow it worked. And oh, how it worked. During its reign, the deck showed a level of dominance over the metagame previously unseen, taking over 40% of all top 4s while it was legal, similarly for top 8s and top 16s. The deck's immense popularity resulted in tournaments like these, where seeing a non-Caw-Blade deck in the top places would be the exception, not the norm. These are serious tournaments, by the way. The smallest of the ones presented here was a 57-player event. And it was also winning. A lot. With a win rate of 47.06%, you could come to an event, flip a coin, and if it came up heads, the winner would be playing Caw-Blade. If it was tails or landed on an edge, another deck could take it. The deck's reign finally ended with the banning of both Jace the Mind Sculptor, which was a problem in its own right, and Stoneforge Mystic on June 20th. This was a blow to the alternative game plans of the deck, which brought it to a slightly more reasonable level. Still, even with 2 of their strongest cards banned, the deck showed up. It took 1st, 2nd and 4th in the Star City Games Open Seattle, and 6 out of the top 8 places, though not the winning spot, in the 2011 US Nationals. So with that in mind, this one goes straight to position number 1 in the power ranking, and I have a feeling it's going to be difficult to dethrone. Now as we move to Hearthstone, let's discuss the second inclusion criterion that I'll be using here. We will only be considering decks that have been played for at least a couple of weeks. That's especially pertinent for Hearthstone because, by popular acclaim, the strongest Hearthstone deck ever was Release Demon Hunter. But it also saw its first cards nerfed after about 24 hours. So while it might have been, and I believe it was, the most dominant for that brief moment, I don't think it really lends itself to any worthwhile comparisons because its impact on the meta wasn't really quantifiable. But for a deck whose impact could be quantified, let's head back to 2014. With the release of Curse of Naxxramas, we get to meet the Undertaker, a stat scaling engine that, coupled with a number of strong death rattles in the format, formed the core of a powerful Hunter deck that reaped the benefits of the Undertaker getting bigger, while their minions dying provided the Hunter player with multiple upsides, allowing them to take control of the match early and not lose it until the match was over. We don't have exact meta-share numbers, but we do have an anecdote from a Blizzard employee that they shared in a Reddit thread of it hitting 25% at one point. That's 25% play on ladder, which I'd say is much harder to achieve than a similar presence within the top 4 or top 8 at a couple tournaments. Now, on the other hand, the deck was quite cheap to craft and not super complicated to pilot, it being Hunter, probably inflating its play percentage beyond what its considerable power level would already merit. So we have kind of two effects pulling in two different directions here. Since we don't have access to the data showing if indeed and for how long Hunter kept up that 25% plus performance, we'll have to rely more on tournament data. The big difference compared to our previous examples is that Hearthstone utilizes what's called the Conquest format. Instead of playing a best of 3, a best of 5 with potentially sideboarding, you bring a number of different classes to a tournament. At the time it was usually 3 or 4, and each round is won by the player who's able to win with each of their decks once. Hearthstone also didn't really have as regular a tournament schedule as some of the paper card games that we will be discussing, at least not ones that had their results endure the test of time, and most of them also have a slightly smaller number of competitors, often only providing the decks for the top 8. But the deck was indeed quite well represented. 50 out of the 88 players in the period played it. It wasn't without comparison, by the way. 67 of the same 88 players played some form of Warlock, though that's realistically 2 to maybe 3 different builds. Zoo, Handlock, and potentially Control Warlock, which might be different from Handlock or might be the same thing depending on which part of the period we're talking about. So Undertaker Hunter, undoubtedly the single best deck in that period, but the way those tournaments were structured, it couldn't really dominate. It was a known quantity, most of your opponents would bring it and you should have been prepared for it, but for both the players' and viewers' enjoyment, tournaments would feature more than just Hunter v Hunter mirrors, if only due to the nature of the Conquest format. A bit more on the anecdotal side, it was played as one of their deck choices by 3 out of the top 4 competitors in the 2014 World Championship, including both the winner and the runner-up. So the results it got cannot be discounted, but it also didn't fully take over the meta. Finally, its reign ended after about half a year with an Undertaker nerf aimed at taking away its survivability. With it no longer gaining health, it was easier to ping away or trade with, leading to the deck being overshadowed by other archetypes. I hazily remember playing against it a lot back in the day, and recognize that facing it 1/4 of the time on ladder probably has sucked, but I'd still personally place it on the bottom of my power ranking here. Moving a bit into the future, come spring 2016, Shaman as a class was already in a decent place, brought to the America's Spring Championship by all 8 players. It's worth mentioning that discussing Hearthstone in this era, we have the opportunity and perhaps the danger of being able to include casual play meta representation, thanks primarily to the good people of vicioussyndicate.com. While that gives us a significantly bigger sample size, it's probably a metric that won't be influenced by the dominance of a single deck in the same way that tournament top cut stats are. Because ladder stats are not perfectly elastic. Even if there's a very OP deck, not everyone will be able to build into it, especially F2P or low spenders, and while that also applies to other card games, certain decks may be cost prohibitive, that has more of an impact on casual play rather than tournament play. So it will be more impactful here as we are including more of casual play in our metrics. There's also a good number of casual players who simply won't make the switch to a specific deck just because it increases their EVs, they may simply play what they enjoy the most. This group will be more represented in casual play than tournament top cuts. The deck we are about to discuss, Midrange Shaman, first shows up around mid-September 2015. There's still some competition in the mix. It is still not the single most dominant Shaman deck, it splits Shaman's representation with aggro variants. Now mid-range Shaman was a tempo strategy that maintained control of the board using a mixture of efficient minions like Tunnel Trog, Totem Golem and Think From Below, and removal spells like Hex, Lightning Bolt and Lightning Storm. It could adapt to different matchups quite well, prioritizing either fighting for the board or going face, to either outlast aggro or get under control. It takes about another month of the meta cooking for it to subsume aggro shaman as the top 1 version of the class. Not long after, in the end of October, it reaches 22.25% of total meta share. It remains the single best deck until mid-December, where it becomes dethroned by the very fast Pirate Warrior and splinters into 2 distinct strategies, both of these an effect of mean streets of Gadget Sun dropping. Offshoots of the deck live on until at least mid-February, but they are only tangentially related, as shown by them having different names here. Now, taking a look at tournament stats, we can see the main reason why we might be more interested in tracking overall play representation. Since Undertaker Hunter's time, the format has evolved. Players can now bring 5 classes, need to win with 4 of them to win the match, with 1 ban available per player. With Hearthstone having 9 classes at the time, no Demon Hunter, no Death Knight yet, that means that for a class that's comfortably within the top 3 or 4, the representation is likely going to be 100%. Maybe the occasional 87.5 if a single player in a top 8 thought otherwise. To put it in a different way, for a deck to not have 100% representation, there would have to be a player who thought it to be within the 4 worst classes out of the 9 available. This is unlikely to ever apply to the best deck, but also to the second best deck, third best deck, and so on. Especially in a meta that already had 2 recognizably bad classes, Paladin and Priest, often played by 0 players in these events, even leading to this funny headline. So with the way the tournaments were structured, it's no surprise that through the 9 tournaments in the period, 98.85% or 86 out of 87 scoring competitors brought Shaman. But for reference, 92% of them brought Druid, so while the 100% after 100% representation here might look impressive, the differences between the best deck and one of the best decks doesn't look that huge. So with that in mind, I think Shaman Stone has to go to the bottom of our list here. Similarly to Undertaker Hunter, its impact on the casual metagame was undoubtable, but with an even more resilient tournament format, it wasn't ever in a position to dominate pro play in the same way the Magic decks we discussed did. And even in casual play, it did allow for a plurality of other decks to exist alongside it. Moving on to Pokemon, let's reveal our penultimate caveat. We will only be discussing big card games. While there might have been a very strong deck in Veto, the card game focused on 17th century Polish history that I'm the only surviving player of, there is very little data on it online, so I'm gonna stick to the big ones, thus Pokemon. The release of Furious Fists in August 2014 sees the emergence of a deck style centered around the Pokemon Seismitoad. In all iterations of the deck, it was a control deck, utilizing the Toad's Quaking Punch, which locked the opponent out of using items. As this happened, you could utilize Disruptive Trainer and Supporter cards and support Pokemon to slowly accumulate damage and ultimately take the win. The deck then received a number of powerful support pieces in November 2014 with Phantom Forces. But to become the incarnation that we'd like to discuss here, we need to wait until the release of Roaring Skies on May 6, 2015 in the US. This brought about Shaman, which slotted into the deck perfectly to give it the consistency that allowed it to really start to inch over into Tier 0 territory. It also centralized the previously slightly different variants of Garbodor Seismitoad, Crobat Seismitoad, and Tasty Toad into a more singular identity focused around the Shaman plus Toad core. The deck was picking up speed just in time for its first major tournament, Australian Regionals 2015, where it took the top 3 places as well as 8th, with a whopping 50% top 8 presence. However, this would be the only major tournament the deck would dominate. Perhaps with the exception of Dutch Nationals 2015, of which no evidence survives online. Seriously, if you know anything about what these players played, let me know. Soon after, it was hit by a quick ban on June 15th. A ban to Lysander's trump card, one of the cards from Phantom Forces that, coupled with the addition of Shaman, brought the deck into Tier 0 territory. And this balanced out the deck perfectly, it turns out. While it remained a strong contender for the title of the top deck until Seismitoad rotated out, seeing decent meta representation at US Nationals and Worlds 2015, winning the former and coming up second in the latter even, it prevented the deck from taking over the meta entirely. It also caused the deck to return to a more fragmented state, with the Garbodor and Crobat variants both being in contention while presenting somewhat different approaches to the strategy, so the ban resulted in a single Tier 0 deck transforming into 2 Tier 1 ones. So while the sheer strength of the deck and its place within the format are unmistakable, we have to dock points on longevity. The quick ban returned it to a healthier level, and it only got to dominate one major tournament before it split into multiple decks, and since we are looking for a single deck here, we can only count that one tournament. Still, it did get to dominate a tournament, so I'm going to plop it in between our Hearthstone decks here. Now, traveling back in time all the way to 2010, the common knowledge version is that it was the 2010 US Nationals, when Garchomp and Sableye, already in the meta from 2009 and 2008 respectively, plus a slew of disruptive supporters got combined into the deck as we know it, creating Sable Lock. My data shows that similar decks were already played before, during the US State Championship in March, but that might be splitting hairs at this point. The deck's special sauce was using Sableye's Overeager to ensure going first, then using its Impersonate move to copy a disruptive supporter, such as Cyrus's Initiative, to hamstring the opponent before they even got a chance to play. The deck played a good mix of other tricks, being equally able to take early game knockouts on weak Pokemon while the opponent struggled to recover from the early disruption. In 2011 with Black and White, a rules change loosening the restrictions on what a player can do turn 1 allowed Sableye the interesting opportunity of having a guaranteed turn 1 win, an FTK. This was met with much outrage, but did it allow the deck to dominate the tournament meta? Not quite. This one, while it is a long-running candidate for one of the strongest decks in the format, and it does present a memorably disruptive playstyle, it did share the meta spotlight with a number of other decks at the time. Gengar, Luxray, Gyarados strategies, to name a few, depending on the period. And that is reflected by the statistics here. 8.2 to 9.5% top 4 to top 16 representation in 2010, and around 7 to 7.5 if we take into account the deck's entire runtime. This deck is an interesting example where its win percentage and top 2 percentage was actually higher than its top 8 and top 16. 11% win rate in 2010, 9.45% in total. This indicates that while it probably didn't have overwhelmingly high popularity, it was capable of placing high when it was played. And don't get me wrong, there have been a couple tournaments where it looked like it dominated, like this one in April 2010 or this one in June 2011, but these still happened alongside other tournaments where Sable Lock was completely missing from the top tables. The cards that made up the strategy were rotated prior to July 2011, just in time for US Nationals. This one definitely gets bonus points for longevity. It remained among the top decks for over a year, but since we are measuring dominance and longevity is only a bit of a bonus, Sableye simply cannot compare to some of the 40% win rate monsters that we've already discussed, and even its play rate doesn't seem as high as some of the Hearthstone powerhouses, and this brings it to the bottom of the power ranking for me. Moving to our final card game, Yu-Gi-Oh!, let's reveal our last caveat. We only include decks for which there's data online. While I don't doubt that there is a number of super dominant decks from 2008, doing the comparisons that I'm interested in on these simply isn't possible because the data availability is minimal. So, for our first Yu-Gi-Oh! Deck, let's pick something quasi-modern. Our first deck, Tearlaments, was, from its infancy around August 2022, already putting in decent numbers. Its strategy, held up by the two pillars that are self-mill and summoning fusion monsters with strong effects like Kid Kalos or Kaleido Heart, allowed it to reach 15 to 20% of top 4, top 16 rates, but that was not yet the incarnation of the deck that we are looking for. To fuel its mill-centric game plan, the deck utilized multiple packages at the time, notably Danger and Punk. So its performance at the time was the performance of a closely interrelated group of decks plural, not a single deck, at least in my opinion. So these stats serve to establish the provenance of the deck we are looking for, which would only arise or indeed erupt all over the metagame after the release of Magnificent Mavens on November 3rd, 2022. This brought Tearlaments a match made in heaven, in the form of the Ishizu package. By far the single best engine for the self-mill reliant tier archetype. And this, Ishizu tier, is the deck we're looking for. Now, data availability here can be a bit spotty, so we're gonna be operating on percentages of known decks. So if we see 100 Tearlaments out of 500 decks in our sample, but 100 of these decks are unknown, we're gonna go with 1 in 4 or 25% being Tearlaments instead of 1 in 5 or 20%. I will also mainly concentrate on top 4 and top 8 here, as despite the best efforts of the good people at Yu-Gi-Oh! Pro Decks and Road of the King, we don't quite have the full top 16s for many of these tournaments. But on both these fronts, Ishizu tier was omnipresent, clearing the 40% mark and indeed approaching 50% of known decks in the top 16, across the 53 tournaments that happened during its time. To sensationalize it a bit, the deck was piloted by 16 out of the 37 winners of these tournaments that we know the deck lists for. A 43% win rate, in other words. The decent conversion from top 16 to winning or taking second place, much like was the case for Magic the Gathering, is evidence in my eyes of the deck not just being popular, but indeed being able to place well at those top tables. The deck kept up its strong performance for about 3 to 4 months until a ban list in early February 2023 hit Tearlaments Kid Kalos with a ban hammer, while limiting Havnis, Merle, and Shiran and 3 Ishizu cards to 1 copy per deck. The deck had a couple death rattles afterwards, winning a tournament here or there, but the next couple expansions saw it get outpaced by new or less ban-targeted strategies. An already very decent deck finding the exact complement it needed in a newly printed archetype created the perfect storm of meta dominance. While it had a lot of competition from other Tier 0 Yu-Gi-Oh! Decks across time, when it comes to dominance, I found it especially worth including since, first of all, it's relatively recent, providing us with a wealth of data, but it also did win a no-ban list tournament at one point, against all the other most degenerate strategies. Showing extremely high tournament representation for a period of over 3 months makes Tearlaments a worthy competitor for Cobblade, and though the top 4 to top 16 rates here are slightly higher, Cobblade's has been across a larger sample size and over an even longer period of time. So this persuades me to put Tearlaments in position 2 of my power ranking, though just by an inch. This final deck we're about to discuss is centered around the Zodiac package, released in February 2017. Notably, the following cards: Zodiac Ratpier, which serves as the deck's source of quasi-card advantage, Zodiac Trident, which has a powerful removal effect, and Zodiac Broadbull, which can prolong your combo and give you access to other cards in your deck. These, coupled with the low requirements of summoning the Xyz monsters in the deck, and the sheer insanity that was Zodiac Barrage, allowed for the combo to first gain prominence as a package to be used in other decks. But later, it crystallized into a deck of its own, known as simply Zodiac, or Zodiac Pure if you want to mark the difference from when it was used as a package alongside different strategies like Infernoid Zodiac or True Draco Zodiac. It only took until March 2017 for Ratpier to be placed on the semi-limited list, allowing players a max of 2 copies, but that didn't necessarily stop the deck. Now, data gathering for this one proved a bit tricky, especially since Konami apparently decided to discontinue the archival Yu-Gi-Oh! Blog midway through my research process, but we got something. And the something is truly unprecedented. Across the 16 major tournaments I was able to find the decklists for, Zodiac boasted an over 50% representation in both the top 4 and the top 8. If you decided to hang with the entire top 16, only then would you see the percentage of Zodiac players drop to sub 50%, and not by a lot. And that's just Zodiac Pure. Wanna know what percentage of top 4 decks played either it or an offshoot like True Draco or Infernoid Zodiac? 77.05%. 73.73% of all top 8 decks in the period. That's 87 out of 118 known top 8 decks on some form of Zodiac. And it doesn't end there, because there's a number of tournaments where we don't know the full top cut, but we do know the winners. So for an example, Zodiac won 11 out of 15 Latin American national championships, prevailing in Argentina, Bolivia, Guatemala, Panama, Brazil, Chile, Ecuador, Colombia, Mexico, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, losing in the Dominican Republic and Peru to, you guessed it, the True Draco variant of Zodiac, in Trinidad and Tobago to an Infernoids variant of Zodiac, and in El Salvador to True Draco, marking the one LATAM national tournament where the winning deck didn't include the Zodiac package in some form. If we include these tournaments in our win rate calculation, which I will, it turns out Zodiac won 19 out of the 30 tournaments in our sample here, a 63% win rate. The deck was finally brought to a more reasonable power level with the ban of both Zodiac Trident and Zodiac Broadbull in September 2017. And the stats here leave me with little choice but to crown Zodiac Pure as the king of my little power ranking. And over 50% representation over a decent time period is truly something special. Huge thanks to the staff of the websites on screen right now for preserving and sharing the data that allowed me to make this video, as well as the content creators who made it substantially easier for me to refresh my knowledge of the formats discussed. And thanks to you for making it through this long video with me. Let me know in the comments what other decks you believe should have made the ranking, and being a YouTuber, you know I'll appreciate if you leave a like or a sub. I've been Simon from Games Deconstructed, and I hope to see you in the next one.